Hello and good evening, everyone. Um, I wish to thank Overman Foundation for having given me the opportunity to deliver talks on Sri Aurobindo's The Future Poetry. And we have been discussing the poetics and poetical philosophy of Sri Aurobindo as in his book, The Future Poetry, over the past few months. And today is the concluding talk of this series as we reach the last chapter of Sri Aurobindo's book, which we had taken up chapter by chapter to analyze and understand. So let us now see what Sri Aurobindo, the master poet, philosopher, and critic, has to say further about poetry of the future. So, after having dealt at length with the characteristics of the poetry of the past and the probable features of the poetry of the future, which he says is going to be more mantric in nature, we find him taking up in more detail the problem of poetic speech in connection with the new poetry that is to be. Sri Aurobindo says, the future poetry, which shall, in all probability, be the utterance of the deepest soul of man and of the universal spirit, will have to find new and fit manner of speech. There will not only be a more complete vision, but the poet will express what he must in the inmost language of the soul experience and sight of the spiritual mind. It's not that we haven't had this kind of poetic substance of the inmost things of the spirit before, or an expression of the psychical and spiritual seeing, but it has been effected only in rare moments of inspired speech. Otherwise, the general trend has been the use of the outward imagination and intelligence, and the direct language of the inmost experience of the soul has come through some kind of symbol or figure. And where the direct self experience of the soul has found a true expression, it has been limited within the bounds of purely spiritual poetry. For instance, the Upanishads used this direct language for the inward experience, or poetry of the Far East, which express a psychic feeling of nature, or poetry expressing some mystic state or an especial religious emotion or experience. Examples of which we find in Western Asian and Indian literature, and a few also in European literature. Now that a different and more creative movement has begun, the task of the poet is to find a new poetic speech. There is an expansion of the inner way of vision now to outer and inner things, subjective things, objective things. There's a seeing by closer identity of the self, of man himself, with the self of things, of nature. And the poet must find just the suitable language and speech to express these, the direct utterance. And figures and symbols, if they need to be used, must be used as a real correspondence and not as a veil for the direct language. And Sri Aurobindo here lays down some conditions which need to be fulfilled for the full emergence of this new and vaster, deeper significance of poetic speech. And he says the first condition is the complete spiritualization of the general human feeling and intelligence, a process which is yet in its initial stages. The human mind is at the borders of two kingdoms at present. Sri Aurobindo says it is coming out of its phase of materialistic intellectualism and moving towards a primary intuitive seeking. In its straining after truth, the intellect has been brought to this seeking and has slipped over unexpected borders. Therefore, do we find the uncertainties in many directions, some of which can be treated as transitional efforts, and if these be the final movement, we shall find ourselves in a brilliant corruption and decadence, to use Sri Aurobindo's own words. And Sri Aurobindo tells us about two kinds of intuitivism, the vitalistic and the psychical. The vitalistic intuitivism, whether in the subjective or objective form, lingers on the borderland, unable to penetrate its own thick lustres and reach a truer spiritual vision. The psychical intuitivism is half entangled in the vitalistic and gathers a strange beauty and also some brilliance. Sometimes it takes on morbid colors, vague mists. Sometimes it's a mixture of half vital and half psychic motive. Sri Aurobindo says the Irish poets brought into English literature a purer psychic intuition with a spiritual issue. And Whitman's poetry and of his successors is of life raised and illumined by an intellectual intuition of the self of man and the soul of humanity. Between this type of poetry and the subtlest elevation of all that has yet been done is an intermediate region, Sri Aurobindo says. There is, for instance, the poetry of Tagore, which is not fully illumined with the spiritual sight, but imbibing an air of spiritual seekings with a cadence found in a psycho-spiritual heaven of subtle and delicate soul experience, which manages to transmute the human and earthly by the radiance of the higher light. And the success and appeal of Tagore's poetry, and of course, Tagore is a very popular poet. It shows the tendency of the human mind of the age, what it is seeking after. But all these put together are not the whole of what the human mind is seeking after, nor is it the main issue. What we are seeking for can only be got when there is a fusion of the supreme light of the Spirit, the perfect joy and satisfaction of the subtlety of a finer psychic experience, and the strength and amplitude of the life soul open to earth and heaven. This sovereign unity has to be expressed in a great poetic utterance. And Sri Aurobindo finds it very likely that the first discovery of this perfect identity and fusion will be made by the poets of the East and perhaps in the Eastern languages. For the East already has a greater nearness to the spiritual sight and experience by temperament, and it has only to make more perfect the turning of this sight on the life of man to accept and illuminate, to reach and realize that for which the human mind is seeking. Compared to this, the West is now just about emerging into the outer half lit circle of spirituality, and even here it's hampered by an outward intellectual pressure. Yet, it has the advantage of a wider ranging thought and a more questing eye, and once these set upon the right direction, there may be a better expression, not so much restricted by past spiritual traditions. Thus, there are the two mentalities Sri Aurobindo talks about: the large spiritual mind of the Orient, and its eye turned inward upon the self and eternal realities, and the other is the Occidental, with its free spirit and inquiry of thought, and its courage of the life energy, and the earth and its problems. And Sri Aurobindo says it's the shock of these two, the Oriental and the Occidental mentalities upon each other, that must produce the poetry of the future. And here I'm quoting some lines from Sri Aurobindo's book, where he writes: "The whole of life and of the world and nature, seen, fathomed, accepted, but seen in the light of man's deepest spirit, fathomed by the fathoming of the self of man and the large self of the universe, accepted in the sense of its inmost and not only its more outward truth, the discovery of the divine reality within it and of man's own divine possibilities. This is the delivering vision for which our minds are seeking, and it is this vision of which the future poetry must find the inspiring aesthetic form and the revealing language." Unquote. So today, whether we can be aware of it or not, there's a great spiritual pressure under which the world is trying to make itself anew. Old things are giving way to new. So it's only reasonable that the greater breadth of this new spirit shall demand new molds and speech, and some of the old nations, which had hitherto been the vehicles of poetic creation, may not be able to lead us anymore, and may fall into a decadence. So we shall have to look for new poetical literature in the future, some which are struggling to be born, or yet are in their youth, or some which have established themselves in this tradition already, but not yet reached the greatest heights or found the greatest voice. Sri Aurobindo talks about the decadence of a language, which may be due to several causes. A language may become stagnant if it so remains attached to past traditions that it cannot get away from that without risking its very existence or straining, even breaking its possibilities. A language may also decay when, exhausted in its creative vigor, it passes into the dangerous phase of art for art's sake. Then poetry no longer remains an outpouring of the soul and life, but becomes what Sri Aurobindo calls a hedonistic indulgence and dilettantism of the intelligence. We can see signs of such decadence in greater European languages, and any attempt at sudden transformation of the spirit and cast of poetic language becomes no less than a critical experiment. But it is in this very travail that a compelling force works. There's a saving element which is at the root of the call to change, to manifest the new potentialities. The power of the spirit is strong enough to transmute life and mind. The old literatures may yet be rejuvenated and made young again and begin a new creative cycle if this magical power can be fully accepted and the poetic mind does not long flounder among perverted inspirations or half motives. In this context, poetry of the English language has both advantages and disadvantages. English literature can truly boast of great achievements, but Sri Aurobindo says it has not all exhausted its natural vigor, nor has it fixed itself in any dominant tradition. As we have seen in some of our previous discussions on the course and character of English poetry, the poets and artists have constantly been lovers of the free spirit of poetical adventure and have ever been ready to depart from old moorings and explore the unknown. Added to its great power of imagination is the boon of its intuitive language, which it has employed in the intuitive expression of the life of the soul. And it is also seen in some measure in the utterance of its inspired intelligence. Therefore, English, according to Sri Aurobindo, is a predestined instrument for the new poetic language of the intuitive spirit. But there's a bit of a risk here, and that is the nature of the Anglo Saxon mind, which is more directed towards externalities. Yet, this has been the very source of strength when combined with the Celtic imagination and made for the strong hold on life displayed by English poets. But this has been a cause of failure too, where spiritual poetry is concerned, as it has continually pulled back poetry from reaching the height and fullness of spiritual attempts. Today, of course, things have changed. The Celtic originality, for instance, of the Irish mind and the psychic delicacy of vision has found its way into the English language, which makes it no longer the tongue of the English people only. Similarly, the higher spiritual mind and imagination of the Indian mind is also sending its messages to the English poetic field. Countries which yet do not have spiritual independence, being still absorbed in their material making, can bring many new elements to increase the spiritual potentialities of the widespreading English language. The poetry of Whitman is one proof and example of this. Thus, Sri Aurobindo says, it is among the European languages that there's the best chance of the revolution of the spirit finding easily its poetic utterance. It's here, by the union of a great vital energy and the possibility of the spiritual vision, that there can come about naturally that utterance of the unity of life and the spirit. In Sri Aurobindo's words, and I'm quoting, the pouring of a new and greater self-vision of man and nature and existence into the idea and the life is the condition of the completeness of the coming poetry. Unquote. Something similar, a large setting and movement of life, was the supreme creative stimulus in the great literatures of the past ages. A fresh intellectual or aesthetic motive, like in the 19th century, cannot create literary work of the very first order. For real inspiration to function, a more complete movement is needed, a larger horizon of life and heightening of the flight of the spirit. The change that's been seen over the literary horizon began with wider cosmic vision, sense of greatness and possibilities of the individual and the race, the idea of unity of the human race and of the human mind with the life of nature. This expression, made one with the expression of life, is what gives the poetry of poets like Whitman a largeness and vital air more than feeble refinement and art of most contemporary European poets. Art must be made one with the sincerity of the spirit and the greatness of impulse, and accompanied by a sense of a new birth and the potencies for the future. The intellectual idea could not accomplish this itself, but had to find its own greater truth in the spiritual idea and its finer cultural field in a more subtle psychic experience. The contemporary poets have prepared the way for this very thing. Even then, the expression of this profounder experience is not enough. This has to pass into a complete spiritual realization. Also, it has to enter into the general sense and feeling of the human race, rather than be restricted to individual intellect, and it has to take hold upon all thought and life and remold them in their image. The future poetry must help this spiritual realization by giving to it its eye of sight, shape of aesthetic beauty, and revealing tongue. And its main substance must be this greatening of life. And here I am quoting a passage from Sri Aurobindo's book, which is very seminal to the understanding of the theory of future poetry. And these are the lines I'm quoting. Sri Aurobindo says, "It is in effect a larger cosmic vision, a realizing of the Godhead in the world and in man, of his divine possibilities as well as of the greatness of the power that manifests in what he is, a spiritualized uplifting of his thought and feeling and sense and action, a more developed psychic mind and heart, a truer and a deeper insight into his nature and the meaning of the world, a calling of diviner potentialities and more spiritual values into the intention and structure of his life. That is the call upon humanity, the prospect offered to it by the slowly unfolding and now more clearly disclosed self of the universe." Unquote. So that, I suppose, is in a nutshell what Sri Aurobindo has to say about the future expectations and potencies. And he also says that those nations are of the coming dawn which can more and more include these in their life and culture and make them real. And poets who see with this vision fully and speak with this inspiration, irrespective of their race and language and culture, will be the creators of future poetry. Thus, we find the future poetry, as foreseen by Sri Aurobindo, shall be mantric and of a universal character. And poetry shall be the vehicle of a spiritual communion, the utterance of the truth, and so future poets must, by definition, be seer poets. For Sri Aurobindo had written elsewhere that our aesthetic and spiritual endeavor must be to ascend with art and poetry to the highest heights. The whole course of evolution of poetry is at par with and linked with Sri Aurobindo's concept of evolution of consciousness. As in the evolution of mind to higher powers, so also in the evolution of poetry, the stress is on the power of the spirit. That is why Sri Aurobindo has prophesied the advent of the mantra, the utterance that comes from an overmind inspiration. But for that, we have to receive the sound and the rhythm in the soul and see behind the surface sense of the words. A mantra, Sri Aurobindo says, is born out of and disappears into the infinite. As he had written in a letter, to leave the obvious surfaces and get deeper is the only road left for poetry. But that has been done in the ancient past. So, what is so unique in Aurobindonian poetics? What new thing does he propose? Of course, Sri Aurobindo is proposing a spiritual aesthesis, elevating poetry to the highest status it deserves. But this spiritual poetry will be more universal and created in many languages, especially English. Because, as he said, not only is English the most widespread tongue capable of greatest mystic expression, but the mind of the future will also be more international. That is a proposal characteristically Aurobindonian. Yet, Sri Aurobindo also says that poetic value does not necessarily command mass understanding. But that is exactly what he has himself prophesied, the general, more universal nature of mantric poetry. So, do we encounter a paradox here? No, not one exactly. For Sri Aurobindo has already explained the nature of future evolution of poetry, which shall be an index of the growth, expansion, widening, and heightening of the human mind and consciousness. That will certainly mean that more and more of the human race shall be on the path of its spiritual transformation, and poetry can come here as an aid. A time may come when even mantra and spiritual poetry shall command mass understanding. The inspired utterances shall be made more generally and universally. In fact, that is what Sri Aurobindo's philosophy is all about. And if we are even now well grounded in a higher consciousness, we can comprehend much of the substance of his book, The Future Poetry. That is the demand actually, to raise ourselves above our human mentality, to exceed our intellect. That is the demand, that is the hope, that is the prophecy. And as an instance of how the mantra will be uttered in poetry in future and in the English language, we may read Sri Aurobindo's own work, his grand epic, Savitri, a legend and a symbol, which is a supreme creation of a visionary and seer poet. So, even if today the audience is scanty and the spiritual aesthesis not widely popular, in the future the frame may change. In fact, it certainly will, and we shall value our seer poet by the measure of his vision and speech, as Sri Aurobindo said. So that brings us to the conclusion of some kind of exposition of Sri Aurobindo's poetics and his philosophy of the future poetry. So thank you all so much.